Good morning, everybody. Purpose of this video is to take a look at topic 8.9, the Great Society. Let's get right to it. Okay, so when we're talking about the Great Society of the 1960s, it is important that we root this in the tradition of American liberalism. Liberalism is the idea that above all else, individual freedoms and individual rights are what matter the most. And we've seen this kind of pop up in different points of the course, going back to the American Revolution and Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence as a great enunciation of those freedoms and those rights, and kind of being re-emphasized during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address. And then by the time you get to the 1910s and again into the 1930s, you see liberalism being applied more in a context of taking government action to try to help protect those freedoms. In earlier generations, you were protecting those freedoms from the governments that would violate individual rights. But now in the 20th century, throughout the 20th century, really, there's an ongoing trend towards using the government, well, expanding the powers of the government to help protect those rights. And so this is important to take a look at within a Cold War context here, because most definitively in the Cold War context of this, we can talk about this being an element of anti-communism. Uh, the expansion of the Soviet Union and the ideological struggle against communism there. 1960s American liberalism definitely fits into this. We will see a lot more detail on this in the 1960s when we look at topic 8.8 about and get deeper into issues with the Vietnam War. Okay. On the home front, the Great Society programs are going to really kind of espouse a firm belief in the efficacy of government power to achieve social goals. So, this is using government intervention to achieve a level of equality in the United States and as a way to help protect American freedoms. We saw this developing in the 1950s in the civil rights movement with the Supreme Court and Brown versus Board of Education and the use of the 101st Airborne with the Little Rock Nine and the government kind of stepping to the forefront. This type of liberalist mentality reaches a high point of its political influence by the mid 1960s. So this is kind of where this late, I mean, kind of starting, well, let's go ahead and like finish out this slide. Now we'll kind of go big picture again. So during Lyndon Johnson's presidency, Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, he is the first president from Texas, and so there's a little bit extra attention that College Board tends to give to him, but he is really a central figure with his role in the Great Society and with his role with the Vietnam War, not always very positive on all of this. But with his programs, his domestic agenda, he is giving expression to these liberal ideas, and they are in his presidency is going to try to use federal legislation and federal programs to address these social issues. So you can kind of see some mirroring, a little bit of repetition that shows in the two parts of this slide. The big thing is like it's important to, I mean, I think it's useful, if it's not important, to try to compare the Great Society programs of the 1960s with the New Deal from Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. In the 1930s, there was this huge expansion of federal government power to try to fight the problems of the Great Depression. Well, in the 1960s, there's going to be a similar expansion of federal power to try to fight other issues, whether that means poverty or discrimination or other social issues that are coming up. And this seems to be a movement, at least in the early 60s, that is still growing and gaining momentum. But by the late 60s, well, that's going to be a little bit later for us in Unit 8. Okay, so let's get some specifics as to what the Great Society is actually going to try to do. Initially, the focus of the Great Society programs was on the prevalence of poverty in the United States. There was a feeling that despite all the affluence going on in the United States in the post-war economic boom, that there was still a persistent problem of poverty in different parts of the country, both in urban America and in rural America. We talked about this with the book that kind of popped up here in the top right corner back in 8A. In 1962, Michael Harrington publishes The Other America, where he's kind of like exposing some of the issues and concerns about poverty in rural and in urban America and offering some suggestions about what can be done to fix this. When that book comes out in 1962, Kennedy is still president. And then when Kennedy is shot and killed in November of 1963, LBJ takes over as president. And when he is running for election in his own right in 1964, LBJ kind of talks about the war on poverty and specifically talks about education reform as was a major campaign point for him. So when he is elected in 64, reelected, if you want to think about it that way. And by 1965, LBJ is following through on that with passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Date on this is 1965. This law is going to greatly expand federal funding for education in elementary and secondary schools. This has been throughout all of American history really thought of as education is really kind of a states' rights kind of demeanor. But now with the idea that this is a more integrated economy that crosses state lines, Congress approves of increasing funding to elementary and secondary ed. And this is elementary schools and high schools, and really focusing this in areas where there is like a lower economic base. Establishes what's referred to as Title I schools, and you may have heard that term. These are school districts in lower economically depressed areas, where there's going to be federal funding to try to encourage economic opportunity or education opportunity through providing government funds. And this is kind of like emblematic of what the Great Society programs are going to try to do, trying to use a government law to try to increase economic prosperity, to try to address the issue of poverty. Along these same lines, there's going to be the creation of the passage of the Food Stamp Act and the creation of the Job Corps. The Food Stamp Act is going to create the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That is SNAP. This is something that is still in effect today, and it is going to provide some federal assistance for families that are in such a state of poverty that they need assistance just for basic nutrition level. The Job Corps is going to provide job training for low-income families so they can try to improve their economic standing through getting better job opportunities. The two logos on this, these are current logos because these are like programs that are still in place. So in the 1960s, this is really seen as being like a real huge step forward to help achieve the Great Society. The idea that the United States is really should be on track to be the model society for the entire world. Second element to this is going to be trying to combat racial discrimination. We have seen this, in topic 8.6 and in 8.10 on the civil rights movement, but here we can kind of make a connection and just kind of like name drop the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But embedded into this is the concept of affirmative action, the idea that there should be, not just from the federal government, but from businesses and from state governments, affirmative action, positive measures being taken to help correct the effects of discrimination of the past. And this is designed to help prevent making the same mistakes that were made during Reconstruction. In Reconstruction, amendments to the Constitution were made, but there was no follow through to make sure that things were going to make progress. And as a result, the promises of Reconstruction failed until you get to the 1950s and 60s. Here in the 1950s and 60s, the federal government is making an affirmation that there must be positive steps continuing to be made in order to have this kind of pull through. You may look at this and you may kind of catch the little bit of current event issue, because whether it comes down to a semi-welfare state or if it comes down to abuse of welfare programs or abuse of affirmative action programs, these are getting into some politically debated topics in the 21st century. century. And this is where we're starting to see more and more modern politics, have their origins, these topics, these issues having their roots here in the 1960s in this political context. Area number three that comes in with the Great Society programs has to do with the Immigration and Nationality Act. This is a law that is going to effectively repeal the quota systems of the 1920s. The idea that there was going to be a limitation of immigration based on what national origin immigrants were coming from. Those laws in the 1920s were very exclusionary towards Southern and Eastern European immigrants, and almost completely exclusionary to Asian immigrants and African immigrants and even Latin American immigrants. So when that is repealed in the 1960s, what you see as a result of this is going to be a change of the immigration pattern coming into the country, where you're going to see more immigration coming from different parts of the world as these immigrants are going to seek access to political, social, and economic opportunities in the United States. This is going to have a real impact on increasing the level of diversity in the United States. The U.S. population gets to be a little bit less of just a white, black sort of ethnic makeup, but bringing in Latin American and Asian population groups in greater numbers as well. And again, something that is going to be a politically debated topic in the modern world in the 2020s is going to have to do with the level of immigration and immigration regulations on how you allow people to enter into the United States. And then, maybe one of the most impactful organizations that's established, government agencies that established, is Medicare and Medicaid. These are government-funded healthcare systems, not for everybody, but either for the elderly in the case of Medicare, or in the impoverished in the case of Medicaid. This is going to address the war on poverty. It's also seen as an expansion of Social Security of sorts, as an old age pension, old age healthcare benefits. And again, this is a program that is seen as, it's heralded as being like hugely effective in increasing life expectancy in the United States. But in the 21st century, one more time, you see questions about the expense that's associated with this, and you see questions about the equity and how this is applied to different population groups. And so in the 1960s, this is all really kind of regarded as being a huge step forward. But if you kind of like take a little bit of a look ahead into the 70s and 80s and into the 21st century, there's questions about the fairness and the equitability of this and of the expense that goes into all of this, and issues that we will kind of talk in more detail as we move out of the 60s and into subsequent decades. But here in the 1960s, the Great Society is really seen as like a peak of this 1960s liberalist movement, where it is all about trying to use federal government power to try to protect the rights, political, economic, and social rights of all Americans, an increasingly diverse group of Americans.